On Christmas, my son's wife said, "You deserve nothing without us." So I took my coat and left. But before I ever walked out into the cold that night, before I ever closed that door behind me, there was a whole lifetime that led me there. My name is Margaret. I am 76 years old and I live alone in a small house on a quiet street where the trees grow taller than the rooftops and the sidewalks crack a little more each year. It's not much, but it's mine. And for most of my life, it was full. I've always been the kind of person who didn't ask for much. I was raised to believe that you work hard, you keep your head down, and you don't complain. If something hurts, you bear it quietly. If you love someone, you show it by giving, not by demanding anything in return. That's how I loved my husband, and that's how I raised my son. I met my husband when I was just 20. He was kind, steady, not much for big words, but always there when it mattered. We built our life on ordinary days, long shifts at work, simple dinners, evenings side by side in front of the television. We weren't rich, but we were content. When our son was born, I poured everything I had into being a mother. I stayed up through the nights, packed lunches, walked him to school, helped with homework at the kitchen table. I tried to be patient, tried to be gentle, tried to be the kind of mother who made home feel safe. His father worked long hours, so most days it was just the two of us. He used to follow me around the house, asking questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, why bread needed to rise, why people got old. I'd laugh and tell him I didn't know all the answers, but we'd figure them out together. When he left for college, I cried in the driveway after his car disappeared down the street. My husband wrapped his arm around me and said, "We did our job, Maggie, he's ready." I wanted to believe that. Years passed. Our son built his life, met Karen, married her, moved to a bigger house in a nicer neighborhood. We were proud of him, truly proud. But slowly, without any big argument or dramatic moment, things began to change. Visits became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. Holidays became something to schedule, not something to share. After my husband passed away, the world went quiet in a way I wasn't prepared for. The house felt too big. The nights felt endless. I tried not to lean on my son too much. He had his own family now. I didn't want to be a burden. So when he called, I answered cheerfully. When he didn't, I told myself he was busy. When weeks went by without hearing from him, I reminded myself that this was just how life worked now. Karen was never unkind to my face. Not exactly. But there was always a distance. A careful politeness that made me feel like a guest instead of family. She'd say things like, "We're so busy these days," or, "You know how crazy life gets," whenever I hinted about visiting more often. I learned to take the hints. By the time last Christmas came around, I was already used to feeling like I had to earn my place in their lives. That Christmas morning, I woke before dawn, as I often do now. The house was silent except for the ticking clock in the hallway and the faint hum of the heater. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about how different mornings used to be. When my husband was alive, Christmas meant noise. He would wake early and start clattering around in the kitchen, pretending he didn't know where we kept the mugs just so I'd come help him. I'd hear cupboards opening and closing, then his voice calling, "Maggie, I think they moved again." By the time I reached the kitchen, coffee would already be brewing, and he'd grin at me like he'd pulled off some great trick. Every year, the same routine. and every year it made me smile. Now there was only quiet. I sat up slowly, my knees aching, pulled on my robe, and went to the kitchen to make tea. I never learned to make coffee the way he did. After he died, I stopped trying. While the kettle warmed, I looked at the small bag by the door. Inside were a change of clothes, my medicine, and a few wrapped gifts for my grandchildren. I had been invited to my son's house for Christmas dinner. Karen had called 2 weeks earlier and said, "We're hosting this year. You can come if you want, but it'll be busy." Busy, that word again. Still, I said yes, because I didn't want to spend Christmas alone. As I sipped my tea, I told myself not to expect too much. Just be grateful you're included. Don't be in the way. Don't say anything that might make things awkward. I put on my coat, picked up my bag, and waited for the taxi. When it arrived, the sky was still dark, and Christmas lights glowed softly in windows as we drove through town. I pressed my forehead to the glass and let myself hope, just a little. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year they'd be glad I came. I didn't know then that by the end of the day, I would be standing alone in the snow, wondering how everything I believed about family had slipped so far from my hands. The taxi pulled up in front of my son's house just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The neighborhood looked almost unreal, every roof dusted with snow, every window glowing softly with Christmas lights. It was beautiful. And for a moment, sitting there with my bag in my lap, I let myself believe I was heading into warmth. I paid the driver, stepped out, and walked up the wide front path. My breath came out in small clouds as I rang the doorbell. I could already hear voices inside. Laughter, music, the sound of children running back and forth. Karen opened the door. "Oh," she said, blinking when she saw me. "You're here already." It wasn't early. It was exactly when we had agreed. "Merry Christmas," I said, trying to sound cheerful. She stepped aside and turned away before I was fully inside. "You can hang your coat there," she said, pointing toward the closet without looking back. I did as she said, then stood for a moment, unsure where to go, my bag still in my hand. The living room was full. My grandchildren were on the floor, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and bright new toys. Karen's parents sat on the couch, laughing loudly, mugs in their hands. A couple of their friends stood near the tree, talking over each other. No one noticed me at first. Then my son looked up and saw me. "Hey, Mom," he said, coming over. He gave me a quick hug, light and brief. "You made it." "Yes," I said, "Merry Christmas." "Yeah, Merry Christmas," he replied, already glancing back toward the room. I handed him the small bag of gifts. "These are for the kids." "Thanks, Mom, you didn't have to," he said. I wanted to say I wanted to. That it made me happy to do something for them. That it made me feel like I still had a place in their lives. But I just nodded. Karen clapped her hands from the kitchen doorway. "All right, everyone, dinner will be ready soon. Margaret, you can sit over there for now," she said, pointing to a chair near the far end of the table. It wasn't a bad chair, but it was away from the center, away from the conversations, away from where everyone naturally gathered. I walked over and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. As time passed, people moved around me, talking, laughing, passing drinks. No one asked how I was. No one asked about my house, or my health, or how I'd been managing alone. When I tried to join in once or twice, my words seemed to get lost in the noise. So I stopped trying. I told myself to be patient, to be grateful I was here at all. When dinner was finally ready, Karen called everyone to the table. She pointed me again to the same chair. Everyone else clustered close together, passing dishes, bumping elbows, laughing as they served each other. I waited until someone handed me a plate. "Here you go," Karen said, placing it in front of me without meeting my eyes. "Thank you," I replied. The food smelled wonderful: turkey, potatoes, vegetables, fresh bread. I took small bites, careful not to rush, listening to the conversations around me. They talked about trips they were planning, about work, about people I didn't know. My son laughed easily, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. I watched him and felt a quiet ache in my chest. Halfway through the meal, Karen stood up, holding her glass. "I just want to say something," she announced. The room quieted. "This year has been hard for everyone," she said. "But I think it's important to remember how much we rely on each other, how nothing we have would be possible without family, without support." People nodded, a few murmured agreement. She smiled, clearly pleased with herself, then let her eyes travel slowly around the table. When they reached me, they stopped. "Some people forget that," she continued. "They forget that everything they have comes from the family that supports them, that without us, they wouldn't really have anything at all." My stomach tightened. I looked down at my plate, hoping she would move on. She didn't. She tilted her head slightly and said, still smiling, "You deserve nothing without us. Family is what gives your life value, right?" For a moment, the room was very quiet. Then a few people laughed, unsure if it was a joke. I felt heat rush to my face. My hands began to tremble slightly in my lap. I lifted my eyes and looked at my son. He was staring at his plate. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at me. In that moment, something inside me went still. Not angry, not loud, just clear. I set my fork down carefully and pushed my chair back. "I think it's time I go," I said. Karen frowned, surprised. "Go, but we're not even done eating." "I know," I replied. My voice was steady, even though my heart was pounding. "But I don't think I'm really needed here." My son looked up at me then. "Mom, what are you doing?" I met his eyes. I saw confusion there and discomfort, but not understanding. "I'm taking my coat," I said, "and I'm leaving." Karen gave a short laugh. "Don't be dramatic, it's Christmas." "No," I said quietly, "it's honest." I stood up, my legs shaking slightly, and walked away from the table. No one followed me. No one tried to stop me. I went to the closet, took my coat from the hook, slipped it on, and picked up my bag. My hands moved slowly, like they belonged to someone else. As I reached for the door, I paused for just a second. Waiting, hoping. Maybe he would call my name. Maybe he would say, "Mom, wait." Maybe he would finally speak. He didn't. So I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and sudden. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The sound of laughter and music vanished all at once. I stood on the porch, my breath coming out in white clouds, the snow falling softly around me. Christmas lights glowed up and down the street, warm and cheerful, like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. I felt very small. For a moment, I thought about knocking, about going back inside, about apologizing for making a scene, even though I knew I hadn't. I had done that kind of thing before. Many times, but this time my feet wouldn't move. So I turned away from the house and started walking down the steps, out into the street, into the cold. I didn't know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't stay. The snow was falling more steadily now, small flakes drifting down under the glow of the streetlights. I pulled my coat tighter around me and started walking, my shoes crunching softly against the thin layer of ice on the sidewalk. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind me, the house stood bright and warm, full of noise and life that no longer included me. Ahead, the street stretched out quiet and empty. For a moment, I wondered if anyone inside would notice I was really gone, if my empty chair at the table would stand out, if my son would finally look up and ask where I was. But the house stayed silent. No door opened. No voice called my name. So I kept walking. I didn't have a plan. I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I knew was that I couldn't turn back, not after what had been said, not after what hadn't been said. The cold crept through my gloves and into my fingers. My cheeks burned. My breath came in short clouds. Still, I walked on, letting the rhythm of my steps keep me steady. As I moved through the unfamiliar streets, memories came to me uninvited. The first Christmas after my husband died, when I sat alone in my living room with a small tree I hadn't bothered to decorate properly. The Christmas 2 years later, when my sons said they were too busy to host, but maybe we could meet another time. The slow-way holidays had turned from something shared into something arranged. I had told myself not to be sensitive, not to expect too much. Now I wondered how long I had been teaching myself to accept less. After a few blocks, I reached a small bus stop. I sat down on the cold bench and hugged my coat around me, my bag at my feet. The street was quiet except for the faint hum of distant traffic. When a bus finally came, its lights cutting through the snow, I climbed on without even checking where it was headed. I dropped the fare into the box and took a seat near the back. The bus was mostly empty. A young couple sat near the front, whispering and laughing softly. A man in a heavy jacket slept a few rows ahead of me, his head against the window. No one looked at me, and in that moment, I was grateful for it. I rode until the bus reached the end of the line, then stepped off into a part of town I didn't know very well. Small shops lined the street, all closed for the holiday. The wind cut through my coat as I stood there, unsure what to do next. On the corner, I saw a small motel. Its sign flickered softly in the snow. It wasn't much, but it was warm. I crossed the street and went inside. The lobby smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. A young woman sat behind the desk, her eyes tired but kind. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need a room for the night," I said. She looked at me for a moment, taking in my thin coat and small bag, then nodded. "Just for tonight?" "Yes," I replied. Then after a pause, "Please." She typed on her keyboard, then slid a key across the counter. "You're lucky, we had one left." "Lucky?" I almost laughed. I took the key and made my way down the narrow hallway to my room. Inside, it was simple. A bed, a small table, a lamp, a bathroom that smelled of soap and bleach, but it was warm and that was enough. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees. That was when the tears finally came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady tears that slipped down my cheeks and soaked into my scarf as I pressed it to my face. I cried for my husband, for the life we had built, for the years I had tried to be invisible so I wouldn't be in anyone's way, for the moment at the table when I had realized just how small my place had become. I don't know how long I cried. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I lay back on the bed, still in my coat, staring at the ceiling until my eyes closed. When I woke, pale light was coming through the thin curtains. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then everything came back. The dinner, the words, the door closing behind me. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to sit up. It was Christmas morning, and I was alone in a motel room. I went into the bathroom, washed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red. My hair was tangled. I looked older than I felt. "You're still here," I whispered to my reflection. "That counts for something." I packed my bag, returned the key, and stepped back out into the cold. The snow had stopped, leaving everything quiet and bright under the winter sun. At the bus stop, I waited with my hands tucked into my sleeves, watching the road. On the ride home, my phone buzzed in my pocket. For a second, my heart jumped. I pulled it out. A message from my son. "Mom, where did you go? Karen says you just left. You could have at least told us." I stared at the words. You could have at least told us. Not "Are you okay?" Not "Come back." Not "I'm sorry." My fingers hovered over the screen. I thought about typing a long message, about explaining how much it had hurt, about telling him everything I'd swallowed for years. Instead, I typed only 3 words. I needed space. Then I turned my phone off and slid it back into my pocket. When I reached my little house, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. I hung up my coat, set my bag down, and stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of home. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt like safety. I made myself tea and sat at the kitchen table, watching sunlight creep across the floor. Outside, the world went on celebrating. Inside, I let myself be still. That afternoon, I opened the small wooden box where I kept important papers. Deeds, insurance forms, and the will my husband and I had written together years ago. I hadn't planned to look at it, but as I held the papers in my hands, Karen's words echoed in my mind. "You deserve nothing without us." I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, clarity. I spread the will out on the table and began to read. And for the first time since my husband died, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Why am I still trying to earn a place in a family that doesn't treat me with respect? I sat at the kitchen table long after the light outside began to fade, the will spread out in front of me, my cup of tea untouched and cold. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking the quiet. My husband and I had written that will together years ago, back when we still thought we had plenty of time. We sat right here, papers between us, gently arguing about small things. He wanted everything simple. I wanted to make sure everyone was taken care of. At the time, it had felt natural that most of what we had would go to our son. The house, the savings, a few keepsakes for the grandchildren. He was our only child. Of course, we would leave him what we had built. But that had been before the years of distance. before the quiet humiliations, before I realized how small my place at their table had become. I traced my finger along the familiar lines of text and took a slow breath. It wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity. I understood in that quiet moment that love should never be used like a debt. That support should not be thrown back at you as if you owe your worth to someone else. And that respect should not depend on how useful you are. Karen's voice echoed again in my mind. You deserve nothing without us. No, I whispered to the empty room. I deserve peace. The next morning, I called a lawyer. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed the number, but my voice was steady when someone answered. I told her my name and said I needed to update my will. Is everything all right? She asked gently. Yes, I replied, it finally is. She gave me an appointment for later that week. In the days that followed, my phone rang again and again. First my son, then Karen, then my son again. I didn't answer. There were messages. Mom, please call me, we're worried. Karen didn't mean it like that. You know how she talks. The kids keep asking where you went. I listened to them once. Then I stopped. Not because I didn't care, but because I was tired of explaining my pain to people who only wanted me to smooth things over so everything could go back to how it was. When the day of the appointment came, I put on my best coat and took the bus into town. The lawyer's office was small and quiet, tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The lawyer, a kind man with gray hair and gentle eyes, greeted me and led me into his office. What would you like to change, Margaret? He asked, opening a folder. I took a breath. I want to make sure my home goes where it will be respected, I said. And my savings, I want them to help people who actually need them. He listened without interrupting as I explained about my husband, about the life we built, about how things had changed since he passed. I didn't describe every detail of Christmas, but I said enough for him to understand. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, "It sounds like you've thought about this a lot." I have, I replied, and I'm sure. We went through everything slowly, calmly. When it was done, I signed my name at the bottom of the new document, my hands steady. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd taken something away, but because I had finally chosen myself. That evening, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. My son stood there looking tired and pale, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Mom, he said softly, can we talk? I stepped aside and let him in. He glanced around the living room as if seeing it for the first time in a long while. Then he sat down across from me, rubbing his hands together. Why didn't you call? He asked. We didn't know where you went. I went somewhere warm, I said quietly. That was enough for that night. He winced. Karen feels terrible. She says she didn't mean what she said. I looked at him for a long moment. And what did you mean, I asked, when you said nothing at all? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't know what to say, he muttered. I know, I replied. That's been the problem for a long time. Silence settled between us. Finally, he said, you scared us, Mom, just leaving like that. I nodded, good. Because now you know what it feels like when someone you love disappears without explanation. His eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I saw the little boy he used to be. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I believe you," I said, "but sorry doesn't erase what happened." He swallowed. "I heard you went to a lawyer." "Yes," I said. "Why?" he asked, his voice shaking. I leaned back in my chair, feeling tired but calm. "This isn't about money," I told him. "It's about respect. I won't spend the rest of my life trying to earn a place at a table where I'm treated like I don't belong." He lowered his head. "We never meant to make you feel that way." "But you did," I said gently, "and I've been carrying it quietly for years." He nodded, wiping his eyes. "What do you want from us now?" I thought for a moment. "I want honesty," I said, "and kindness. If I'm going to be part of your life, it has to be because you want me there, not because you feel you should." He nodded. "I'll try, I promise." "I hope so," I replied, "but your actions will matter more than your words." He stayed a little while longer, talking about the children, about work, about small things. When he finally stood to leave, he hugged me tightly. "Don't disappear again," he said. "I won't," I replied, "as long as I'm not made to feel invisible." After he left, I sat alone again in the quiet house, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. Weeks passed. Things didn't magically become perfect. Karen never apologized to my face. She sent a message through my son saying she felt bad and hoped we could move on. I accepted it for what it was. I saw my son and the children again after that. Short visits, careful conversations, but something had changed. I stopped bending myself into shapes that made me easier to ignore. If I went, it was because I wanted to. If I didn't, I stayed home and enjoyed my peace. And slowly, the quiet began to feel like freedom. Now, on cold evenings, I sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the lights come on in the houses across the street. I think about that night I walked out into the snow, unsure where I was going, only knowing I couldn't stay. I don't regret it, because leaving wasn't running away. It was choosing myself. On Christmas, my son's wife said, "You deserve nothing without us." She was wrong. I deserved dignity. So I took my coat, and I left.